Hello everyone, welcome back to the Anatomy Lab. Today we're going to be taking a look at the sarcomere, which is the basic and functional unit of the skeletal muscle. So when we say the words basic unit, what we mean is that this is going to be a repeated unit throughout skeletal muscles. And what they'll do is link these together one by one by one by one. And they will form these long chains, or rather long fibers, called myofibrils. And then when you have a group of myofibrils together, that makes up a skeletal muscle fiber, which is a skeletal muscle cell. So these are what you find all throughout skeletal muscles, but when we say functional unit, what that means is that this is going to be the part that does the function. When you use your muscles to contract and pull on things and shorten the muscles like this, what you're doing is shortening the sarcomere, and when you do that together, all of those sarcomeres shortening, all of those sarcomeres kind of pulling itself together is going to be what causes a muscle contraction. So whenever you lift weights like 5 pounds, 10 pounds, 100 pounds, 200 pounds, whatever it is, it's all due to these little sarcomeres shortening together to create force. Now, with the sarcomere in mind, we have some specific things to look at, though. And there's something missing, which I will put on right now, which is this. So if you look closely, there is a special couple of organelles that we'll find here. And the first of which is kind of this greenish mesh-like structure that's surrounding the myofibrils and the sarcomere, this is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So this is special to the skeletal muscle because this is where you're going to be able to store calcium. So when you store calcium, this is actually going to be an important part for allowing muscle contractions. So this is going to have the calcium in it, and when stimulated, it's going to release the calcium to be able to allow that muscle contraction to occur. But if you also look going across the skeletal muscle cell, across the sarcomeres, you have these things that are going, across it. These are called transverse tubules, otherwise known as T-tubules. So it's not as clear on just one sarcomere, but essentially, these T-tubules allow your stimulus to get from the outside of a skeletal muscle cell deeper inside to stimulate not just the outer fibers, but the internal fibers as well. So, with that said, let's go ahead and get started by taking a look at the specific parts of a sarcomere. Now, looking at this sarcomere, you can see that there are a few major parts. And if I separate this a little bit more, it becomes even more apparent, where in the center, you can see that you have this relatively thick blue part in the middle. This is called the thick filament. And you can see that it goes all the way from here to here. And if you look closely, the thick filament is going to have these little golf club looking things on the ends. These are called myosin heads. So the thick filament is made up of myosin, and the special part of myosin is that it has these little knobs called myosin heads. And believe it or not, these little heads are the things that pull the sarcomere closer in to shorten it and cause the muscle contraction. So it's really the myosin heads doing all the work all together. But to finish talking about the sarcomere, look closely at the ends and you can see something very different. So thick filament in the middle, but then on the sides over here and here, you can see that you have these other ones, which if you have a thick filament, guess what you also have? Not thick, but in this case the opposite. This is the thin filament. So the thin filament you can see colored in red, and the red part specifically, these little red balls that are chained together, is actually the protein that the thin film is made up of. So that would be called actin. And actin is special because it's going to have these little spots on the actin, which is where the myosin heads can bind to it. So the way that they work together is that you have the little golf club-shaped myosin heads. It's going to bind to the actin and then pull on it, and pull on it, and pull on it. And when it does that, it, once again, shortens the sarcomere. So to look at the parts of the thin filament, though, there's a little bit more than just actin, because it's not just the red, there's also the yellow and the green. So the yellow part is actually something that prevents muscle contractions from happening. this is going to inhibit muscle contractions to allow your muscles to stay relaxed. Because, I mean, if you imagine using your muscles, you're actually not using most of your muscles right now. You mostly want them to stay relaxed. So what you have here is this little yellow spiraling thread, this little thread that's spiraling around it and covering parts of the actin is called tropomyosin. So tropomyosin is this little yellow thread. This is covering the myosin binding sites to make sure that the myosin can't bind to the actin unless you want it to. And if you want it to, you have this one last thing. And if you look really closely, you might be able to see these little green balls. And they're pretty small, but they are going to be right along the tropomyosin, right on the actin. This is called troponin. So troponin, this is going to be bringing in something that we talked about earlier, but troponin is going to be able to move the tropomyosin out of the way only if calcium binds to it. So if you remember, you have calcium from your sarcoplasmic reticulum, and when your muscle is stimulated, it will release the calcium. That calcium will go to the troponin and will move the tropomyosin out of the way. When it does that, that means that the myosin binding sites on the actin will now be available for the myosin to bind to and pull on it. And when they pull on the thin filaments, they pull them closer together like this to shorten the muscle. So it will go from a long state or a stretched state to a contracted, shortened state, which contracts and shortens the muscle. And this is how your muscles will ultimately contract by, well, contracting and shortening all of your sarcomeres. Now, with that said, though, there's a few last things that we want to talk about, which are not necessarily big parts of the sarcomere, but rather these specific regions. So if you look closely, we can see that we have some, well, different parts of the sarcomere, or rather regions, describing them a little bit better. So to start, this one, these two on the ends rather, these, if you look at them, look like zigzag lines, and they don't always look like that, but these are called Z-lines, or sometimes Z-discs. So if you ever see two Z-lines, what you'll see is that between it, this is one sarcomere. From Z-line to Z-line, one sarcomere. And then luckily, right in the middle, right in the center of the thick filaments, I mean, when you say the word middle, you might think of M-line. So this is the M-line, right in the middle. So far, Z's on the ends, M in the middle. But this part's going to be a little bit weird, but you have some regions that describe the thick and thin filament a little bit specifically. So if you look closely, we have two ways to describe the thick filament. If it is all of the thick filament, like from here to here, I mean, if you look closely, thick filament is from end to end, right here to here. This is what's known as the A band. But we also have one more way to describe the thick filament, is if it's only thick filament. Do you see how there's no overlap between thick and thin within this middle region? This region in the middle right here is called the H zone. So be careful. If it's all of the thick filament, all A band. But if it's only thick filament, it's the H zone. But lastly, if you look at the thin filament, kind of like the H zone, do you see how there's this region where it's only thin filament, no overlap with the thick filament? This is what's known as the I band. Now, the funny thing about some of those regions is that, I mean, they will be able to shorten, which if you look closely, if a muscle contracts, that's going to cause your H zone and your I band to change length. So right now, do you see how long the H zone is? But if your myosin pulls the actin together to shorten the sarcomere, that H zone is getting smaller and smaller and smaller until it's practically gone. And that will actually happen in the same way to the I band. You have only thin filament, but as it gets shorter and shorter, that I band starts to get slowly smaller and smaller until it's practically gone. So, with that said, that should be just about it regarding the sarcomere. I mean, if you're going to take anything away from like the muscle, look at the thick and thin filaments, think about their parts and their proteins, and remember, muscles contract. Like the way that you generate force is by contracting. You do not create force by pushing it away. So there is a little bit of elasticity, but honestly, the contraction, the force that you make, the way that you stand and move and lift is through contracting and pulling on things. Alrighty, everyone. So that should be just about it. Great job. Good luck with your studying, and I'll see you all next time.